The tragedy of China was that the fertility rate in China was already going through rapid decline at the time they implemented the one-child policy. All it did was accelerated what was already going on. But the good news for the people on the degrowth side is that we're never going to get to 9 billion, and that we're going to peak mid-century, and then we're going to start to decline. End of the story is that you can have all of these scientific arguments and all the rest of it, but if you really want to get into why people are not having kids, it's culture. We're battling with a culture that says now that there's another way to live our lives, and it doesn't relate to the number of children that we have. And if we do have children, actually smaller is better. Don't think that that's not being driven by demographic change. The rise of the nativist right is being driven by demographic change. Sure, it initially started with dealing with the issue of immigration, but a lot of these parties now also have pro-family policies too.
The poorer as a society you are, the more children you have. So the wealth actually seems to be negatively correlated with actually the amount of children
100%.
That you're having.
That are arguing that the best thing that we can do for the climate is to take a vow to say that we're going to have no kids. And it's like, okay, well, that's great because we need to protect future generations. It's like, what future generation?
Can you talk us through the consequences of living on an empty planet?
Well, if you've got no people on the planet, it's an empty planet. And it's been a few millennia that we've actually had human beings on the planet, but we do, Kat, lose track sometimes of the fact that we are a biological species, and that species come and go, and there are possibilities that life on Earth, we can't say that there's zero, that life on Earth will not continue to be amenable to the human population that we have. But the interesting thing about what we're going through right now is we've decided that Darwin might be wrong about human beings, at least, in that the way evolution is supposed to work is that every generation competes to create the next better generation. And human beings have just decided increasingly over the space of the last couple of generations, or longer than that in some places, that the next generation, that's really somebody else's issue. I'm not really that interested in creating the next generation. And the way that we see that is in the fact that people have just increasingly decided to stop having children. And particularly in the developed world, but we're also seeing a similar phenomenon now in the developing world. So if you're not creating the next generation, I don't know how human beings will continue to evolve as a species, or how even we will continue to exist if this trend continues on for a very long time. So we're at an interesting juncture. It's never existed in the history of any species on the planet where we've just decided I would rather not.
As far as I know, we are the only species out there that isn't actually trying to make sure that we stay alive for or that we actually keep our lineage going, our human lineage going. And that there is certainly a lot of people that seem to think that we, the society, the planet as a whole, are simply going to be better without humans on Earth, or with drastically lower numbers. So one of the comments that, for example, I've seen is that the Earth is going to be better, or it was made to sort of be best or to function best with around 1 to 2 billion people. What would you say to that type of thinking or comments?
Well, it doesn't function that badly right now with 8 billion. I mean, was it functioning that much better back in 1950 when we only had 2.5 billion people? I don't know. We were just coming out of a massive world war. I think that these numbers are, very subjective. And I don't know how people come to those conclusions. I've certainly read these estimates. But the key point in all of this, Kat, is that, when we think about what 2 billion would look like on the Earth, it's not the 2.5 billion that existed in 1950. That's that perfect population pyramid where you've got lots of children being born, and we live to a certain age, probably in our 60s, and then we all depart the planet as we must. The population that's 2 billion, if we actually had that going forward in the future, is completely flipped, where it's hardly any children at the top, at the bottom, and lots of old people at the top. And the reason is because most of the human population growth that we're experiencing right now is older people. It's people not dying as fast as they used to. The input side of this is really constricted. So whenever I hear people say this, and by the way, the comments that you're getting, I get all the time as well. It's like, okay, well, what does that look like? And they've never even considered the fact that the human population distribution, in terms of age categories, is completely transformed, and they never consider the idea that the actual distribution of people within different regions of the world is completely transformed as well. So I think it's fanciful, I think it's arbitrary, and I don't think it really stands up to much scrutiny.
Okay, so let's unpack a little bit the idea of the replacement rate. So
Mhm.
it is believed that we need each couple or each woman to bear 2.1 children. And the 0.1 bit is essentially for either the women that don't make it into the fertility or the childbearing years, or the kids don't make it into the adult years. But does that number actually take into account the around the 10% of women that are believed to just be infertile for one reason or the other? Do you know that?
I, I think these numbers again are somewhat arbitrary. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
so do they take into account people not? Do they take into account people actually choosing not to have kids? Because there's this whole theory of what they call population momentum or population tempo, which is that as larger numbers of people who are in the childbearing years of their life come into the population, and we're seeing that in many parts of the world now, come into the population, that they're going to increase the fertility rate. But what happens when the people of this generation decides to behave differently than the ones in the previous generation? Now, the mathematics of the 2.1 actually makes sense. It's one to replace you, one to replace your partner, and then the 0.1 to replace children who don't grow into adulthood and can't have kids. But it's a more complicated situation than the 2.1 communicates. And I would also say that in places where we have most of our population increase coming from, which is in developing countries these days, that their infant mortality rate remains stubbornly high. So 2.1 doesn't actually reflect a replacement rate for them. It's probably
Okay.
higher. It's probably in the mid twos, or even pushing into three, maybe in some of the countries where the infant mortality is really disastrously high. But say, for example, a country like India, which is at a fertility rate now of 2, and most people don't know that. They think there's tons and tons of children being born in a disproportionate number. That's actually what I should say, disproportionate number of children being born in India. Well, their infant mortality rate is actually quite a bit higher than 2.1. So their replacement rate, or their replacement rate's higher because their infant mortality rate still remains high. So the situation's even more dire than sometimes is communicated by that 2.1 number.
Ah, I see. Okay. So looking at the fact that the 2.1 is only our sort of guide figure, and it may vary country to country depending on, like you were saying, for example, the infant fertility, that would be potentially driving it up and down a little bit, or nudge it up and down a tad. Um, One of the very, very, very common questions is essentially around the climate change and how we as humans are essentially making an impact and certainly making our presence felt on the environment. And that essentially, a depopulation would be such a good thing on the environment. Do you actually believe that it would provide us, or provide the air for the climate, some benefits if, for example, there was like 6 billion of people on the planet and that population stayed stable?
Well, part of the issue with even considering that in a serious way is that there's been so little research done on what a declining population does to climate. I mean, when we were writing the book, we only found one study that actually even considered it. Everybody else has been contemplating the opposite, that we're going to get. At the time when we were writing the book, it was 11.2 billion was the number that the UN was saying. It's now 10.4 billion by the end of the century. They came down 800 million in 5 years, by the way, in terms of the end of the century estimate. It's all that would be the third largest country on the earth, and they just changed it in 5 years. But there was almost no research that, well, it was, as I said, one study that actually considered the opposite scenario, which was that maybe the population is going to peak and decline. And how would that affect the climate? I think there's a lot more study that needs to be done on that. But if you believe that the denominator in the equation, which is the number of people on Earth, as it increases, then the pressure on the climate and the environment is going to increase, then you have to also be prepared to accept that if the denominator in the equation goes in the other direction, which is decline, that there's also going to be effects on the climate, maybe in a positive direction. So I don't think it's been adequately studied, but I think that the hypothetical possibility of what you said is something that we have to consider.
Mm-hmm. I think what's really interesting is, like what we were discussing earlier on, a lot of people have got this arbitrary figure of about 2 billion people in their minds. And you said that it was sort of around 1950s, I think, that we had that
Yeah.
that amount of people on the planet. I think the thing that is so difficult right now is to even imagine that amount of people living in the infrastructure that we build around us, because all the infrastructure, starting from cities and transport and services, and the way that our economy works, the way that our society function, is all geared up towards either stable or actually raising, like increasing population. Most of the Western countries, for sure, I don't know whether that's the case on the entire planet, but most of the Western countries rely on the youth to be paying for the pensions and for the health systems for the elderly. So the idea that we can just undo the last 75 years of progress and somehow slip back into, the mid 1950s, for example, and live happily ever after doesn't strike me like a seamless transition that is just going to be joyful for everyone and good for everyone, because it seems like if we were making that transition, we are going to be taking the steps back in some of the progress that we've made, because I'm not even sure whether we can sustain the type of life that we have with that little people.
Well,
What's
I
your opinion
consider
on that?
this. Well, there's a whole movement that's associated with this, the degrowth movement, and it's kind of an ideological perspective. It's not. I mean, they claim that it's science based and all the rest of it, but I don't see a lot of science in it. I see a lot of almost like religion in it. like people thinking that there's some magic associated with a smaller population, and I don't know that there is. I mean, the arguments are that, for example, that we don't have enough resources to sustain the human population. Well, the evidence is right now that we're actually doing a pretty good job of sustaining the human population. I mean, for example, we're supposed to, if you read Paul Ehrlich's book back in 1968, you and I should be on this call deciding who's going to get the last crust of bread where we live. I mean, because we were going to overpopulate the world, and we weren't be able to feed people. The famines that exist in the world today are mostly political. They're things that are a product of decisions that human beings are making about stability in their countries and the ability to distribute the huge amount of food that we make in this world. So it's not about that. It's not. I mean, if you look at the evidence, every aspect of what has happened to human beings over the space of the last 50 years has all moved in the right direction. I mean, longevity. I mean, I'm sitting in Canada talking to you today. The average person in Canada back in the 1920s lived to the age of 57. They now live to the age of 82. And that's progress. In China, they were living into their mid 30s. Now they live to a similar age, into their late 70s. They more than doubled human longevity in a very short period of time, just back to the 1960s. So everything from that you want to take a look at, from longevity rates through to infant mortality, through to declining levels of violence, through to access to food, access to education, human literacy. All of these things have improved over the space of the last while as the human population has got to 8 billion. But the good news for the people on the degrowth side is that we're never going to get to 9 billion, and that we're going to peak mid-century, and then we're going to start to decline. So they may be actually right about what's actually going to happen, but it's not because we see any great benefit in creating their 2 billion society. We're just going to end up there just because of the collective decisions we're making, the individual decisions, that we're making, that add up to the structure that's going to create this decline.
When you said that we will peak at just under sort of or around 9 billion sort of mid-century and then start to decline, I believe that there is a little bit of disagreement with regards to the figures that we will achieve, and that's certainly one of the international bodies that predicts these type of things. You don't necessarily agree with their findings. So can you just talk us through that figure that you've kind of arrived at, and what are some sort of other differences of opinion?
Well, when we were writing the book back, a few years ago, the consensus was that the UN's figures of 11.2 billion, maybe a little too high, but probably somewhere between 10 and 11. Now I think there is a growing consensus among demographers that even the 10.4 number that the UN has put out is probably too high. And the reason for that is because fertility is collapsing far faster than anybody thought it was going to. COVID has had a really strong effect on people's willingness to have children. So they really delayed things, and now our health crisis has become an economic crisis in which people believe that the cost of living has become too extreme. So they're cutting back on the possibility of having families, particularly larger families. So as a result of that, things have collapsed far faster than anybody was predicting. So, the UN still has every year has China higher than actually the Chinese government has, their figures. And we can debate about whether or not China has an incentive to say that their figures are higher than and they may actually be lower than what the Chinese are actually telling us. India is now below replacement rate. They're at 2 and probably going to decline from there. So that's 36% of the global population.
Mm.
Each of them are 1.4 billion people. I mean, where are the other places that are going to replace it? Well, Africa, you say. Well, Africa's, first of all, is not big enough. And they have a stubborn problem in terms of longevity. Even though they produce a lot more children than other parts of the world, even their fertility is declining, but also their longevity isn't as much. So Nigeria, expected longevity is about 55 years of age, like Canada was back in the 1920s. And so they have to put in place their healthcare infrastructure. They have to put in place a more stable political infrastructure. And if they want to take economic advantage of the population that they have and the population growth that they have to put in place the economic infrastructure to be able to create manufacturing like they created in a place like China. So there's a lot of issues that are related to Africa actually being able to replace what other parts of the world aren't having. So when I look at all of these figures, it's just like, I don't know how you get to 10 billion,
mm-hmm.
because unless the Chinese and the Indians are doing it, and they're not, and they're declining, there's nobody else big enough to fill in the gap. And the other models that I've seen that have come out, and there's a really good one that was published in the Lancet that was put out by the University of Washington. Most of that work, those estimates were put out prior to the pandemic, and even their estimates were, probably closer to about 9 billion. Well, that's still a 1.2 billion lower than what the UN, or 1.4 billion lower than what the UN had, which is the size of the Chinese or the Indian population. And this was prior to COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So you sit back and you say, are we going to get to 10.2 billion people or 10.4 billion people? Very unlikely. So somewhere between 8 and 9 billion is probably where we're going to get, and then by the peak, and then by the end of the century, probably something between nine. The total population will probably drop down to where it is today or lower. That's the truth.
When you were writing your book, you essentially went on a worldwide tour to figure out what are the continents doing, what are the countries doing, and what's actually going on. So you've sort of touched on that just in the last sort of 5 minutes, but I was wondering whether you could just give us like a quick step tour of the world and the fertility and how dire or how good the country or a region is situated when it comes to the stable population or the fertility rates.
Yeah, well, none of them really have stable populations. All of them are going to get to the point where they're going to decline. So when we wrote the book, there's it's a lot of data. It's all in the back. So anybody who's reading the book, it's like a long magazine travel log. It's not a. There's only one chart actually in the book. It's not a. And we did it that way on purpose because we wanted people to get into the story because it really is a narrative. It's a story about what's going on. And the bottom line to the story. So to get to the twist, I guess, at the end of the story is that you can have all of these scientific arguments and all the rest of it, but if you really want to get into why people are not having kids, it's culture. And culture can manifest itself in different ways in different places, but all of it works against having larger numbers of children. And it starts with urbanization and the dramatic effect of urbanization on the world. And people talk a lot about how immigration is a huge has a huge effect on what's going on in terms of population distribution. It actually doesn't. Only about 4% of the global population doesn't live in the country in which it was born. Only 4. 96% of the population lives in the country in which it was born. But that 96 is dramatically redistributing itself. And it's going from an urban, smaller town population to almost every day exclusively more urban. Mm-hmm. And when you leave the countryside where children make a contribution to the economic vitality of a family by, for example, working on the farm, in the city that changes. And the incentive to have more children declines because they don't really make an economic contribution, if ever. But if they do, it's till they're much older than they would on a farm. But also what it really does is it changes the choice structure for women. And instead of being, getting married very early to the person who lives in the farm next door in their lives and starting their family in their late teens and their early 20s, they move to the city. They say, look, I want some more economic independence. I want to make choices that are different than my mother and my grandmother made. And I want to get an education, which takes them out of starting their families. And then I want to get a job, which takes them out from starting their families even longer. And so this pattern exists everywhere. But it manifests itself in different ways in different countries. But everybody's going through the same thing. There's nobody going in the other direction.
So just the speed of change is different in certain cultures rather than the direction of travel.
The direction of travel is the same. When it started is different, and how fast it's going is different.
Okay. So the assumption essentially that Africa is going to be that sort of cradle of the world suddenly, is that presumption essentially made on the assumption that their fertility rates are going to stay stable? And what is the actual evidence behind it? Because I think most people believe that Africa is just going to stay this high fertility country, but the actual data doesn't seem to bear that when you went and dug into it. So what did you see when it comes to Africa?
Well, I mean, even the UN's data shows African fertility declining and pretty rapidly. They didn't. And when you dig into it more deeply and you actually look at what's happening in the cities, it's declining even faster in the cities and getting closer to replacement rate in places like Nairobi, for example, where we did take a closer look at things. So the same process that happened in all of these other places in the world, Latin America, Asia, North America, Western Europe, it's all happening in Africa. The question is just the speed at which it's going to take place. And if the past is prologue, what happens is each new region of the world moves into this process. It tends to move faster than the region that preceded it. So the question is, how quickly will things move in Africa? And that's what we don't know. And as I said before, Africa has two issues. One is declining fertility, but also that their longevity is not expanding as rapidly as we've seen it in other places. So they have declining fertility, and unless their longevity expands, we might find that the African population constricts faster than we're predicting.
Do we know what's the reason for them not expanding the longevity on the same sort of track or trajectory as the rest of the world?
A lack of public health care. I mean, if that's really the biggest thing that has an effect. I mean, access to all the things that keep us alive for longer, but also, poverty has a huge impact on this, and there's still a tremendous amount of poverty in Africa. The lack of a growing middle class that we see in places like Asia, it's not happening as quickly in a place like Africa, and the middle class has different demands on the political system, and it creates different types of expectations about what governments could deliver, as we've seen in every other part of the world. So yeah, it's not just a population story; it's a political, economic, social organization, cultural story in Africa. It's a complicated place, and the thing that I discover every time I consider it is how little I know. And
Mm.
so most people just kind of look at the number. My feeling is most people just look at the numbers and don't really get underneath actually what's going on. And I think over time, given that everybody is so certain that Africa is going to provide the stability to the population longer term, I think we owe ourselves the responsibility of going out and actually finding out what's going on. I'm not a hugely optimistic about Africa. And the reason I'm not hugely optimistic is because of the level of political instability, the lack of a rapidly growing middle class, and just the disruptive nature of all of the things that are necessary in order to create a region that has economic power as both a set of consumers, but also as producers, but also the political stability in which capital wants to invest there and is assured that they'll be able to create the type of wealth that they would want to get out of any investments that they want to make. Africa's interesting. There's going to be a lot of change in Africa over the next while.
Can you also talk us through the sort of the India's or the strategy that India went down to limit their fertility? Because obviously we know about the one child program and strategy in China, and I think there is relatively um, well understood sort of picture that was actually happening in China with some of the journalists that were trying to sort of get it out there to actually say the or to describe the realities of that policy. But in your book, you actually mentioned that India had the policy that would sometimes even make the Chinese government sort of cringe, or I can't remember exactly the word you used, but I remember that really stayed in my memory because Chinese took some really Chinese government did take some really gruesome steps to limit their populations. So
Yeah.
what was going on in India?
Well, the Indian process, there was a lot of emphasis on sterilization. It wasn't so much the national government, although the national government did play a role. It was also the state governments exercising a certain amount of influence in this area, and everything from involuntary fertile sterilizations through to paying people to get sterilized, and all the things that go wrong when people actually say that you're going to get money for doing something, and how people organize it in a local way, it can get problematic. And they also had, and we talk about it in the book, their we two, our two, strategy. We should only have two children. But the problem with looking at India in terms of that through that lens is the same problem that exists with looking at China through that lens, that it was government policy. Government policy contributed to what's going on, but what's really happened is cultural change. That's the biggest effect. It's urbanization and then the cultural change that takes place as a result of that. and how women make different decisions about their lives. I mean, my co-author John Ibbotson, who I wrote Empty Planet with, says that the most powerful image in the book, and people can read this in the chapter on India and China, is not anything about any government people that we talk to or any, and we did talk to a lot of people, all over the world about this, but it was that one scene in a slum in Delhi where I was sitting on an overturned 5-gallon bucket in this little classroom made in basically a mud hut kind of a situation. And I was talking to, watching a focus group of younger women talk about what their expectations were about their future families. And they were all saying, look, I want to have control of my own life. That means I have to have my own income, which means I have to have an education. So I'm delaying whatever the process is of, getting pregnant. And I saw, something glow under one of the young women's saris. And she reached in and she pulled out a smartphone and she put it back. And it was like, okay, well, that's over. You can't really control people's understanding about reproduction and how to control their lives if they have access to all the information in the world. They have a data plan. They're able to go out and say, how do I prevent, do a Google search or go on generative AI, do whatever you want. You've got all the information in the world about how you can control your own fertility. So Indian women are doing exactly that. And it's the same in China. The tragedy of China was the fertility rate in China was already going through rapid decline at the time they implemented the one-child policy. All it did was accelerated what was already going on. And if you look at where they are now, where their fertility rate is probably one, the predictions, and these are conservative predictions, I would suggest that they're going to lose half their population through the course of this century. That's the consensus. Even the UN, which I quibble an awful lot with their projections, that's what they have. They're going to lose 660 million people. So you sit back and you say, boy, you want to see a real effective government intervention in this space. There's a great example of it. And the Indian government didn't have that kind of an impact. They certainly probably had some impact, but not as big as in China. But the bigger impact for both was just that people figured out, particularly younger Chinese women and younger Indian women, that there was a different life from the one that their mother or their grandmother led, and they were going to do it by participating in the formal economy and making more of the decisions about their lives. They were going to have more independence in the life that they were going to live, which started with having fewer kids.
Mm-hmm. I suppose the urbanization and the culture that goes with it almost go in tandem. And obviously, then on the other side, you've got the governments with various strategies to either encourage the healthy fertility rates, such as Hungary, for example, or to discourage sort of population growth by a variety of strategies. Now, obviously, Hungary has managed to sort of bump their fertility rates slightly.
It's come down. It's come down again this year. It's come down again this year already.
Okay, so where is it?
No.
Where is it now? Do we know?
The latest data that I've seen is it's still, well below replacement rate. It's like around 1.3 or something like that, and declining.
Okay.
So anyway, sorry, I interrupted your flow. But it
was, no. It's
you wanted to ask a
question. I know, for example, that Hungary's prenatal policies didn't maybe achieve as much as they wanted to on getting them up to the replacement level, but it has influenced the abortion rates, for example, and the marriage rates. And from what I've looked into, Hungary had these policies for sort of around the 10-year mark. And do we actually know of any other countries that have been doing it for perhaps longer, so we can actually see whether any government strategies can influence the culture, perhaps, and nudge it back towards the replacement, and perhaps how long it might take? Because the culture changes that got us where we are now, they didn't happen in 10 years. They probably happened in about 50, 60 years. And I wonder whether it would require another 50 or 60 years to actually sort of influence and nudge the culture back towards the pronatalist position.
So I'll deal with the second part of your question first, and that is, in 50, will we take 50 or 60 years to, get back to a pronatalist position? That's too long. The problem is that 50, 60 years, the average age of a human being is going to be so much older than it is today that unless we come up with another way of creating human beings, we'll never be able to change things because we just can't. We just don't have the population that's capable of reproducing itself, and that's something that I like to emphasize with people is that every day we get less capable of being able to reproduce the human population simply because we age. And until we can figure out another way to produce human beings, it's going to be a fairly hard line in terms of when this drops off. And for human beings, for women, it's usually around the age of 40. But even 30 to 40, every year it just gets harder and more difficult to have children. And then even if we were able to create a situation in which we made it a lot easier, how many 50-year-old women would be having kids or how many 60-year-old women would be having kids. What's really collapsed is the number of people who are under the age of 20 having children.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's really declined. In fact, in the United States, there are more women over the age of 40 having children than there are under 20 years of age or younger. Teenage unwanted pregnancy has collapsed. Probably, everywhere in the world. So on the policy front, the problem is that, yeah, we do have many countries that have been trying this for a long time, and it's basically not worked. I mean, it may have slowed down some things, and, you can just look at the Nordic countries, and they're a great example. Where are you sitting, by the way? What country are you in today?
I'm in the UK, but originally I'm from Poland.
Okay, so Poland, the fertility rate has collapsed. I mean, I think it's just around 1.2 or 1.3. The UK is now still registering its lowest fertility rates in the time that they've been recording it. Scotland is down around 1.2 or 1.3 right now. So it's
Mm-hmm.
basically losing its ability to reproduce itself. If you look at the Nordic countries, they've put more effort into doing this. So Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark have put more effort into this than anybody. And they're dealing with it in two different ways. One of them is to make the cost of having children as cheap as possible. And then the other one is to reduce the motherhood penalty for parents, or the work-life balance penalties that are related to being a parent. So they've done more on it than anybody in the world. All of them are below replacement fertility, and all of them are still declining. And the reason is because it's not a question of market failure. It's not a question of children cost too much. If you made children free, you might see a bit of an uptick in the amount of fertility in the world, but it's not going to be as big as I think people speculate that it could be. And even if you made everything in the workplace completely equal for men and women, and there was no motherhood penalty in terms of working, you might have a small effect on fertility. But those aren't the reasons that people aren't having kids. The reason that people aren't having kids is they just don't want them. They just don't want
Mm-hmm.
them. I'd rather have one. So if you wait to the age of 30 to have a kid, you might struggle a bit to have one. You'll have one, and then maybe you'll have two, and then maybe you'll buy a dog. But the most common number of children in any household in the Western world these days is one. And the reason is because when we have children, it's about basically leading a fulfilling life. Having a family, leading a fulfilling life. Well, do you need four to have a fulfilling life, or can you have a fulfilling life if you have one or two? And most women these days are telling us one or two are just fine, or none. I can have a
Mm-hmm.
fulfilling life without having any kids. So that's what we're battling with. We're battling with a culture that says now that there's another way to live our lives, and it doesn't relate to the number of children that we have. And if we do have children, actually smaller is better, like one or two. And you get back to the degrowth people, and their answer is none is better. Well, after a while, we don't exist. if
Yeah.
that's the if that's the way that it is. And so this is where we're stuck. And that's what Empty Planet is about. We're in this cultural situation in which we have decided that we really just would rather live a different kind of a life, and that means fewer kids in our lives.
The Nordic countries and their setup seems to fly directly in the face of a common excuse, for example, used by Gen Z, for example, for not having children. And it is all about the economics. It's all about the housing crisis. It's all about the wage gap and the wealth gap that exists in society. I've had an interesting comment from a student of economy, out of all places, and I think his assertion was that the only way to sort of bring up the fertility rates is the wealth redistribution. I wasn't precisely sure how we are
Again,
ever going to get that with
just
the wealth
bring them on.
distribution.
Bring them on the podcast. I'll tell them why it's not. No, that's not what it is. It's not what it is. If
Okay,
it
so
was, it would be working in the places where they're doing it, and it's not working.
yeah, and I suppose the one thing that, like, I can see, for example, why Gen Z in particular would feel certain amount of grievance, for example, towards the world, that often there are certain things that we sort of put in their way in terms of achieving stability that perhaps previous generations did have, like, for example, getting on a housing market. But there is also the evidence everywhere that actually the poorer as a society you are, the more children you have. So the wealth actually seems to be negatively correlated with
One
actually the
hundred
amount
percent.
of children
100%.
that you're having.
And that's what you find. That's what you find, Kat. What you find is when you actually sit down and say, "Okay, I'm going to break past the conventional wisdom. I'm going to break past all the arguments that somebody who a person with a good mind could come up with for why this is the case, and see if it's actually true." And what you discover is it's not. So, we do surveys on why I work at Ipsos. We do surveys on this. So, why among people who don't have kids, what are the 3 reasons that they don't have kids? Number one, I don't want them. My life is
Wow.
fine, thank you. Number two, I can't have them. And I can't have them is not for financial reasons. It's I can't find people still feel that the best way to raise children is in a partnered relationship. They don't want to raise them on their own, so I can't find a partner. The next one is I'm trying, but I can't have them. So physically, I've waited until later in my life, and I'm finding it very difficult to have children. And only when you get to number 3 do you start seeing these other things show up, like the cost of children. So the question for me is, so if you go to the number 1 category and you say to them, okay, but children are free, you make them absolutely free. You have no career costs. You have no financial costs associated with this. You can do it for absolutely free. Would you have a kid? Maybe some of them would, but I bet you most of them wouldn't, because that's
Mm.
not what it is. It's. I just do not feel that this is something I want to do. And the irony in it is, you get a lot of people, and I know there's some interest groups that I get, emails from and see things from, where say that are arguing that the best thing that we can do for the climate is to take a vow to say that we're going to have no kids. And it's like, okay, well that's great because we need to protect future generations. It's like, what future generation? It's
There will be
just
no
it's
one
like
to
it's like
protect.
there's this like hard crust of prejudice on this issue that you have to break through to get down to actually what's happening. And when you get into actually what's happening, it turns into a fascinating conversation where you start with the easy solutions, which is if we just gave people free childcare. So in Canada, where I'm sitting, the government over the last 4 years has cut childcare expenses, they claim, to the public by 50%. In that period of time, our fertility rate has gone from 1.5 to 1.3. So in fact, making childcare, if you wanted to get into causal relationships, what this would suggest is that if you cut the expense of childcare, that actually you create an environment in which people want to have fewer kids. Now that's not true. But what probably this is a spurious relationship where there's actually not a great degree of correlation between those two things.
Mm.
So when you start doing what John and I did, which was travel around the world, Go and talk to people, see what their family circumstances are like, and then relate that back to the data. You start saying, maybe it's a little more complicated than saying childcare needs to be free. Now, increasingly, we're going to see governments do that. And you mentioned Hungary, and they're moving very aggressively on this because their population's basically disappearing. Poland, I mean, is going to be faced with a similar. All the countries in the former Yugoslavia, and not only because their fertility rates are really low, but also because they've got a big diasporas now of people who are from Poland. You're sitting in the UK, who've of that age who should be there, the best and the brightest from Poland, and they've decided they're going to leave. So they've got all sorts of issues that are related to this, and which they can spend a lot of capital trying to solve it. But it helps around the edges. But ultimately, the culture has to change, or this won't change. And there's no place that's been able to figure out a way to change the culture. It hasn't happened. Israel is the one that everybody brings up, but it's like a country of 4 million people with a very specific set of issues that they're dealing with.
Yeah, I think it would be extremely difficult, near impossible to mimic what Israel is going through, and why perhaps their fertility rates are still as high, simply because no Western countries are in their predicament, no Western countries are in their geopolitical position, and no other Western countries, or most of the other countries on the entire planet, have got the history that Israel does. And a lot of that, a sense of where you came from and what your sort of nation is going through, is sort of a direct feed into the culture. So yeah, I mean, I know, for example, that Israel does seem to be this exception to the rule, even though their fertility rates are also going down a bit, especially in the more
Well,
secular.
they go up and they go up and they go down. It'll be interesting to see the effect of the Gaza war on that. But sorry, finish your thought.
Um, and I think for me, for example, the Israel was um, the sort of the exception to the rule, but I just can't see how anyone else could replicate that, because we just don't have that baggage that Israel does, that would be giving us, our culture, perhaps a boost towards more pronatal, tendencies.
Yeah, you're right, and that's why I think that this is, and I've been writing about this more recently, is going to be the political issue of this century. I think an
Mm,
awful lot of the political disruption that we're seeing has a demographic element to it, whether it's the effect of immigration, countries taking a more, what they call family-oriented position, which means trying to impose certain types of values on how people should live their lives. All of these things are going to be mediated through the political process. So it's Empty Planet was about what's actually going on. Now that there's more conversation about the consequences of that, then people are going to start going to the political conversation, which is how do we deal with this? And it's a very, very combustible question.
mm,
But you can start to see the political positions starting to form around this. We're going to see some of it actually played out in the next week in the European parliamentary elections. Don't think that that's not being driven by demographic change. The rise of the nativist right is being driven by demographic change. Sure, it initially started with dealing with the issue of immigration, but a lot of these parties now also have pro-family policies too.
mm-hmm.
Rejection of elite opinions in downtown environments, rejections of certain rights that are associated with modernity. This is particularly for women and for minority groups, particularly the LGBTQ plus community and others. There's going to be some really difficult conversations around these issues when we start realizing that what we talked about in Empty Planet and other demographers are now talking about now. We're talking about it before, we're talking about it then, and have been talking about it since, that this is actually the reality of what's going on in the world. And we start kind of rejecting these voices of doom and gloom that are related to global overpopulation that are just basically, not based on any data. It's almost like a religious belief that they have now.
Mm-hmm.
You really can't question it because it's their faith. The truth is the data are showing a different future. And I don't mean to be all doom and gloom for your listeners, your watchers, but I do think that this is going to be a really significant issue. You're going to be hearing more and more and more about it. When John and I wrote the book, and it came out in 2019 in the first edition, when we wrote the book, all of the questions I got from the media and from people like you were about how can you possibly say this?
Mm-hmm.
What's your evidence? And so all the conversations were about that. Today, the conversations are about, okay, we now accept that this is happening. What are the consequences and what are we going to do about it? So even that conversation has changed in a very short period of time. And in any situation like this, there's going to be obvious downsides, but there are also going to be opportunities for people who can think through dealing with the consequences of what's going on. And from an economic perspective, those will be the winners in the future economy. And from a political perspective, they will also be the winners in whatever the future is going to be. So there's going to be tons of opportunity out there as well as dealing with these issues that I've described. But so little attention has been given to that it's
Yeah.
unclear as to what exactly they will be. But when people come to the realization that what you and I are talking about is what the future of the world is going to be, then the smarter minds in the world are going to get focused on that, and we're going to hear more serious conversations then. Maybe we just need to make childcare free,
Yeah.
which is the solution. It's like, yeah, except we've tried it.
I mean, don't get me wrong, I would love it. I've got one, another one on the way, but it's not like, I mean, and the
Congratulations.
UK, thank you. The UK has got absolutely just dreadful prenatal policies. There are none, basically. We get a maternity leave, which is unlike, for example, what people get in the States. But other than that, there is nothing other that is positive on the horizon. They actually tend to penalize, for example, the marriages or the partnerships when one person stays at home. They really want everyone working. They want everyone's taxes. But the interesting thing is about Poland, and like you said, what you were saying earlier on, it's very difficult to just look at the numbers because underneath there is a completely different current that is going on. And I'm actually trying to write about it now because Poland, obviously, their fertility rate dropped. A lot of it probably was driven by a huge amount of young people that did emigrate in the pursuit of better life, and they stayed. Um, but also, Poland
But
is
here's
believed.
a question, Kat. Where they immigrated to, what is their fertility rate? So when they got their better life, did they have more kids? That's an interesting question. Write about
Yeah,
that because you know more about it than anybody. Because
well,
nobody
I
knows.
think
Nobody's writing about that.
I think
Nobody
in
knows.
gen
Nobody appreciates these topics.
yeah, in general, I think the belief is that people then tend to assimilate into the fertility rate that is actually around them. Um, I've got no idea whether, for example, Poles would be different, or Ukrainians would be different, or Hungarians would be different.
Yeah,
For example,
they have the data, and they
oh,
have
do
the data
they?
in the UK. You can look at it, but yeah. But the question to ask you though is, will you have four?
Hmm. I will run out of time.
And this is the
Would I?
thing: the average
Would I
Canadian woman
want
back in
four? Yeah, but I will run out of time to have four.
yeah, and this is the average Canadian woman back in 1960, when our fertility rate was 4, got married around the age of 20, 21, 22, had her first when she was 23, and had 4.
Hmm.
That was the average. That's what my mother had, and we were an average family. So in where you live in the UK, are you in London?
I know I'm actually up in the sticks, sort of in the northwest.
Where in Yorkshire?
No, northwest, so sort of Lancashire. I'm actually sort of near Fylde Coast.
Okay, so when you go out and you talk to people who are in your age group and your similar circumstances, how many of them have 4 kids?
Very, 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 very few, very few.
Yeah, and this is
Um,
and this is the issue.
a lot of people
Or
were
three,
very much.
or just even 3.
Yeah,
even three,
a
because
lot of.
just having two replaces you and your partner. It doesn't add
Mhm,
to the population.
yeah. I'm actually trying to look into Poland, and what I was sort of trying to say before was people believe that Poland has got pronatal policies, but it, it seems like it was a way for a certain government to get elected. What's going on underneath
Probably.
was very, very actually toxic and just really unhealthy towards the future of the country. So, but then also what particularly interests me, for example, is obviously when the Russia invaded Ukraine, Poland took almost, well, their population increased by almost 10% in the matter of months. What will happen with that population? Whether they will assimilate into Poland? Will they come back to Ukraine? That's actually sort of the bigger scale, the bigger picture that I'm trying to look at. Because sort of a 500 plus, what they call, which is essentially just a payment per child, and a year, I think, paid maternity leave. As far as I know, that's as far as Poland goes when it comes to the pronatal policies. But it's certainly interesting to sort of look into how their future will fare with most recent changes, for example, and for example, whether the population that once have has left will come back to settle back there with their kids. Um, so I think that there is so many
It's
things that are still unknown there.
Well, I can tell you what the fertility rate of Poland is because I just looked it up as I was listening to you, and it's
Go on.
1.3.
1.3.
It's 1.3,
That's dire. Yeah.
same as my country. And we also are Canada also has one of the fastest growing populations in the Western world, and it's because we bring in so many immigrants. Our population's grown by about 2.5% over the space of the last year.
Mm-hmm.
But the issue is that now people are pushing back.
Yeah.
The population's pushing back. So it's a
Yeah.
short
And
immigration's a short term solution, and that's it.
yeah, I think that's sort of part of the problem because we know that immigration is a sort of short term plaster on the wound. It doesn't actually address the issue underlying it, but also short term, it also creates different issues in the fabric of society. And I think, particularly in certain countries like the UK, it feels like we are going through the population sort of bomb, like we are literally exploding as a country because there is so many people coming here and just the infrastructure can't deal with it. But even that, like, it won't last in the next 30, 40 years. That's not to say that the next 20, 30 years are going to be particularly pretty, for example, in the country, but it doesn't really change what you were saying earlier on about the global average and the percentage, for example, of people that are, for example, emigrating or moving between the countries as a whole. It might be different
Yeah.
in different sort of regional um, places, but it doesn't really change the direction of travel of the Earth. There is one question really that was coming up a lot, or a lot, one pushback, and it was around the development of the technology like AI, robotics, and the fact that the productivity keeps going up, although that might be the comment about other country, definitely not the UK. The human labor demand will keep decreasing, and the retired people will essentially leverage more technology innovations than the traditional sort of young labor. And that essentially there is this, I believe that less people will consume less energy and raw materials, and overall this is the good for the environment. What can you tell us about that type of reliance on AI as some sort of savior for us in the future?
I think that the everything on the production side of the equation is the low hanging fruit in this conversation. We can get people to work longer. We can adjust the retirement age. We can maybe have some immigration. Maybe we can offshore certain things. This is one of the Japanese solutions where they offshore a certain amount of their manufacturing to deal with the fact that they can't find young factory workers because they don't like immigration. So they haven't got that solution. You can have robots, another Japanese solution, but we're seeing it in other places. But this deals with one half of the equation, and that's production. And yes, it will all help. The problem that we're going to have in terms of economic growth is not production. You can produce things incredibly efficiently, but unless somebody's buying them, who are you producing them for? So the problem that we've got is with an aged population and a shrinking population, it's a non-consumptive population. They're not buying new houses. They're not buying new cars. Robots don't pay taxes. Robots don't buy dresses. They don't go to restaurants. I mean, so the consumption part of the equation is the one that's going to have the big impact on economic growth. Now, some people will say that that's a good thing, and the degrowth people are one of those groups of people. But the economic carnage that's going to take place as a result of this, we're not even talking about.
Yeah. Okay, and then I think last thing that I just wanted to cover or briefly come back to, because we talked around it when we were talking about the Israel, and obviously Israel, I suppose, still does have this sort of clan society feel where the large families still encourage fertility, and that essentially the large families act as a cushion for the younger people, whilst in urban countries the government tends to sort of play that role, and that there is still, for example, in Israel, that feel that your clan, your family, will take on some of the functions of the state. So we know that obviously the Israel is a little bit of the exception, but do we actually have another country anywhere that does have urban society with adequate birth rates other than
No,
Israel?
no. All of them are below replacement rate. And to the extent that they measure the city versus the country, in those countries, the city's always lower.
Okay.
And one of the things is because the factor that leads to this clannish aspect is also religion and practice of formal religion. And in every urban environment, it declines, and in every rural environment, it tends to be more prominent. So Israel is a very unique situation. There are religious groups in other places that do have similar things, like the Amish in North America, the Mormons.
Mormons, yeah.
Yeah, but even they have declining fertility rates. So there are these odd. I don't mean. I apologize. I don't mean odd as in like strange. I just mean as like outlier
Yeah.
type situations from a statistical point of view that people can focus on. But like the Israeli example, these aren't necessarily examples to follow in overall societies. They're actually right in that they contribute to higher levels of fertility, but combined with that, there's actually usually fewer choices that women are able to make in their lives, less participation of women in the formal economy. There's other things that are there that you would have a very difficult time making general across the overall population without an awful lot of pushback. So they're interesting, but they're merely that.
Mm-hmm. What would you say is the one positive message that, for example, you found in your work in that field?
I think there's two that I would offer up. The first one is that unlike many other things that seem to come at us like surprises, or events in a particular day, like Russia invading Ukraine, or what's going on in Gaza right now, or any other thing that you can point to involving the human population. This is one of those very rare things in which you don't have to guess what the future is going to look like. because the decisions around it have basically been made. So all we're going to do is just live through this. You can mark down the fact that in 2030, the entire global baby boom, to the extent there was a global baby boom, is going to be 65 years of age or older. And the good part of that is that it gives you an opportunity to prepare for the reality that's going to be happening. But we have to wake up to that reality, and that's the challenge. I mean, the data are there. It's very clear where things are headed.
Mm-hmm.
The UN's got another agenda. I don't know what they're trying to prove with the statistics that they have, but I think that there's enough contrary evidence out there that suggests that we're going in a different direction. And even the UN is suggesting we're going in the same direction, but just slower. But so we know it's coming. So that's the first thing. And almost everything that I deal with, and I work in the field of market research and public opinion research, you can't say that for just about anything else that relates to human beings. This one you can. So the positive news is we can look at it, we can prepare for it. The second piece of positive news is that anything that relates to the environment, if you're very concerned about the environment, you have to be happy about everything that you are hearing on this podcast. Because every aspect of humans' negative impact on the earth as a result of the sheer size of the human population and the growth of the population is all going to change direction in a very near future. Is already in the process of changing direction in many countries. So you have to be positive about that.
Okay. Well, Darrell, I find your work absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for your time. For the people that want to follow you and find out more about what you do, where can they find you online?
Well, if you want a copy of Empty Planet, it's on Amazon. You can read it in 10 different languages now. It's become a very interesting. It's beyond me now. It's just kind of gone out into the world, and it's finding people like you, who I never would have met unless I had taken the time to work with John on Empty Planet. So that's the best thing, because I get to meet a whole new group of people, and hopefully they will be interested in our work. And then the second thing is you can follow me on Twitter at Darrell Bricker. So I'm. Unfortunately, you'll see a lot of stuff on Canadian politics and a whole bunch of other things that you probably don't want to see. But I still talk about population a fair amount, and we have really focused more on this topic at Ipsos, where I work, and that's at ipsos.com. You'll take a look at what we call our Generations Project, in which we're looking at these issues of population change all the time, and the use and misuse of the concepts of immigration of generations. So, for example, we spent some time talking about Generation Z in the UK. Well, there's no Generation Z in India. I mean, the baby boom in India has just stopped happening.
Mm-hmm.
In Nigeria, it's still happening. Everybody's in Gen Z because the median age is 17 in Nigeria. So, I mean, these terms don't necessarily apply. So we've been trying to talk to the world and most particularly our clients about how they need to think a little more, I would say, incisively about some of these concepts around population. So you can go on there and you can find some really interesting material.
Certainly in the Empty Planet, I've learned so much about just how different countries function, and I've traveled fair amount, but still there was some of the things that you were talking about that even I haven't been to on my travels. For example, certain, you know, less safe places within, for example, Latin America that you ventured to really see what's going on. So highly recommend you get the book and check the rest of Darrell's work. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Darrell Bricker. Thank you for tuning in to Wisdom Rebellion. Before you go, if you enjoyed the conversation, please consider subscribing. It massively helps with keeping the show on the road so we can all build a wiser world together. And if you loved this video, you will also love this one. I'll see you there.